Welcome to the Living Springs Q&A podcast, where your questions are answered live every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Good day, everybody. Welcome to the Q&A podcast. We are here live.
Welcome back, Blake.
Yeah, good to have you.
Thank you. I was just saying, I could have been on here last week. I was kind of disappointed that I didn't. I left the church, and by the time I had got home for the meeting that I was supposed to have, the person had texted and said they weren't coming for another hour. So I actually debated coming back. I thought, would it be weird to like sneak in and just kind of sit down between the two of you guys? For our listeners, they would not know. They just all of a sudden hear my voice, but... yeah.
After we announced that you weren't around, though.
That's true.
I think that could have been kind of cool, though.
It would have been.
Yeah.
Well,
We give you permission next time.
Maybe
And you know
next
what?
time.
For the listeners, we could have, for the longtime listeners, we could have said, whoa, Blake just teleported. And if you don't understand what that reference is, you have to go way back. That'd be 100 episodes ago?
Oh, easy.
Close to that, yeah.
Because it was during COVID
Yeah.
that the teleportation,
Yeah.
the most
Strongly opinionated.
strongly opinionated Blake
But
has
it was-
ever been on all the things we've ever talked about on this podcast.
Was the
where
difference between teleportation and flying.
Yes, where he was like, no, this is where I make my stand, and I will not be moved. That was the issue.
Yeah.
Fair. All right. Well, jumping into this week's questions, we do have some AER.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
First act of recantation before you read our question that came in. Last week we said we didn't have the video ready, and Keelan was back there waving at me. We do have it ready. So I recant as I lied on this podcast and said it was not ready. It is.
For shame.
I know.
All right. Our question, or our opinion, says this: pushback. Although we must have compassion and try to assist in the healing of both, 1, a person has no control over burnout versus an affair, which is a choice. 2, an affair hurts many others, often irrevocably. And 3, it is much more difficult to fix the broken pieces for an affair versus burnout.
So I'm going to assume this is in response to what was the question we were addressing? Moral failings.
Yes.
And I talked about how the first 3 or 4, I can't remember what it is, steps towards burnout and step towards having an affair, for pastors at least, are the same.
Yeah.
And so this is a person who's responding to that. And I would like to, first of all, say, absolutely, I'm not saying they're the same thing. I'm saying that I'm not saying that the consequences of them both are the same.
No.
They are not. The consequences for an affair are much more devastating than burnout. Absolutely. Not debating that in any way. Yep. So I wasn't saying they're the same thing. I was simply saying the beginning steps towards them are the same. And I can't remember specifically what they are. It was the point, I remember hearing it, that struck me as profound. But like one of them I know was lack of personal boundaries.
Right.
And different like at the beginning. I would say, in pushback to this pushback, this person says that a person has no control over burnout, and I would say we do have control over burnout.
Yeah.
And we make decisions every day that lead to burnout. And that's not to say we shouldn't have mercy and have grace on people who find themselves burned out.
Yep.
And a lot of times pastors who find themselves burned out because they're genuinely trying to care for people, they're genuinely trying to help people. Yeah. But that doesn't negate the fact that they, sometimes out of a savior complex, took on more than they were supposed to. Sometimes out of arrogance, and I'm not pointing the finger at anyone in particular, but there's a point where we say, this is my church as a pastor. I'm not talking, like I think when somebody who attends a church says, this is my church, they mean it as that's where I belong. Yeah. And that's a wonderful thing. And I hope everybody who's part of Living Springs feels that way. And I hope that everybody who's part of this podcast who doesn't go to Living Springs has a community where they do feel that.
Yeah.
When a pastor says, this is my church, it can often mean something different. And I'll say that from personal experience. I've been convicted of that by God, that there's been times where God's been like, I will even be praying and I'll mention my church. And God's like, really? And so in my own prayer time, I try to say, when I'm praying for the church over your church at Living Springs or in your church at Living. And I do that intentionally because it was something I was convicted of by God that I was, not that I would ever say it was my church, but there was almost the attitude that, and it can be birthed out of, I think, sometimes good intentions, but it's still a wrong attitude. And so I would say that the steps towards burnout, you have control over. Now, there may be a cost to not taking those steps. And I think that's where probably this person is coming from, that, you know, if a pastor's board is like, you got to work harder and you got to do all of these things, that the pastor has no control over that. But they do. They could say, I'm not prepared to burn out and I'm going to go find another job. So there are avenues there. And I think that while we always want to have grace, absolutely, and I appreciate this person says we must have compassion, and I agree with you there. We also, and I think if somebody was in an affair, we would expect them to take ownership for that. And I think from a place of grace, if somebody was burned out, we should ask them and expect them to take ownership of their part in that. If we don't, how do we help them in the long term? We could be very compassionate and give them a year off that they could totally be rejuvenated, but then they're just going to head down the same path again. So please hear me. I was not minimizing affairs in any way. Yes, an affair is much more devastating than burnout. Although I do think burnout doesn't just affect the pastor, it affects very negatively the pastor's family as well. But an affair would be much more devastating, absolutely. But on as well, I guess at the same time, that you do have control over both of those things.
And that's what you were talking about. The moral failing that we were talking about is the end result of many steps to get there.
Yes.
And so lack of care towards oneself, even things like not filling yourself up spiritually versus just like getting home, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, just vegging and watching Netflix is very different than building up. Time off away from work duties is not always fulfilling and restful if we're just blah.
Well, and the reality is that's not just a pastor thing.
Correct.
That's every Christian thing, right? We are all at times guilty of it, that we get home after a long day at work and we don't spend time with Christ. We don't pray. We don't, do things that would rejuvenate our soul. Even meet with other people, right? Because there's something about being with other people that can rejuvenate us. Instead, we just turn on the TV and sit and veg out, and our soul is not replenished. Psalm 23, he restores my soul, right? That we don't give our shepherd any opportunity to restore our soul. So we wake up the next morning and go back to work, and yes, physically, we have been rejuvenated.
Off hours.
We've been rejuvenated because we've slept and we've rested, but spiritually we have not. And then we learn to live in this state of spiritual deficit that is not healthy for our souls.
I even showed you a couple weeks ago that stat on pastors' physical health, where they're below average even for physical health and risk of heart issues and strokes and many number of issues because of how they care for themselves there. And there's the correlation really clear, I think, of pastors caring for their physical health, which leads to the benefit for their mental and I would argue spiritual health as well. That there's, again, not to say that's the cause of, but they're clearly related. By the time you get to burnout or affair, the pastor could have been guarding against both of those. That leads to the moral failing we were talking about last week.
Yes. But I would also say it's not just pastors.
No.
That's everyone, right? If a pastor burns out, it affects the church in a big way. If the pastor has an affair, it affects the church in a big way. But if someone in the church has an affair, it's just as devastating for that person's family. And if a person burns out and leaves the church, loses their faith, completely deconstructs till they got nothing left, there's devastating consequences to that as well.
Totally.
All right, well, moving into our first question and thinking about deconstruction a little bit, I was asked this week if someone only believes in 12.5% of the Bible, does that make them an eighth theist?
Keelan, we need like cricket chirping audio for you to be able to.
Just before we started, we were talking about starting a sermon with a bad dad joke.
Yes.
And I think that you might have, maybe you took that as like permission for that. I don't know. We were not condoning what you just did in any way.
I hear the unsubscribe button clicking
I
on
just
people's...
like to go back to and maybe change my answer on moral failings from last week.
I've been sitting on this one for a long time because I've been waiting for this question that's coming up, and I'm thinking of you, Kyle. So I'm just thinking, I don't know. I'm just teasing.
Are you accusing me of only believing in 12.5%
Well, I don't
of the
know.
Bible?
Maybe after we're done this question, listeners, you can help me out.
Oh, man.
Okay. Here's the question. Some Garden of Eden questions.
Great.
Number 1. What do you think about the idea that God created other humans before the fall? Would this explain where Cain's wife came from? Number 2. Did carrion animals, carrion, I didn't know how to say that. Carrion animals, vultures, coyotes, or maggots exist in the beginning within the garden, or did God create them after the fall?
Great questions. You looked at me like I'm going to have to start.
Well, I assumed you were going to like jump right in and answer this because this is one of your things.
I'm the heresy in the garden guy. That's
I would just say it's definitely an area of passion more
It
for
is.
you
Yeah.
than it is for us.
Yep, and-
I have some thoughts on this,
Yeah.
but not nearly as passionate about it, I can guarantee, as yours are. So why don't we let you start?
Sure.
And then we'll go after you.
All right, deal. Go after me or follow after me, which one? Depends on what I say.
That's exactly right. I'm withholding judgment on whether I will follow or go after.
This is a subject of importance and of value to me, as you mentioned. There was a lot of a time where I really struggled with my faith because as I was going through high school and early even in my college days, the debate between what was perceived to have to be a debate between science and faith, and having only experienced one thing, lost a lot of friends in the faith, specifically over science questions. That really was upsetting to me.
Can I just...
Yeah.
You lost friends because you were asking them, or you lost friends because they weren't allowed to ask them in their church?
They weren't allowed to ask them in their church.
Sorry,
That
just
they were
wanted to
told, unless
clarify.
you believe in 7-day, this stuff doesn't work, so you can't hold anything other and you got to go. So
Okay.
this has become something that I've become really passionate about and has given me life in how I study the Bible, how I look at a whole plethora of other questions past this one. So to start with number 1, because I think that's how numbers should work, then I'll start. Yes, I do believe God created other humans before the fall, and that would be the first thing that kind of leads to a defense of that is Cain's wife when they goes outside of the garden. That God takes Adam and places him in the garden is kind of the language that's put there. Some people divide Genesis 1 from Genesis 2, where the end of Genesis 1, on the second half of day 6, God creates man, male and female, in his image he created them. He created them in his image. And then there's the specification then of Adam being made in Genesis chapter 2, where it's kind of a narrowing in. God created all of humanity for the whole world. And then Genesis chapter 2, its creation narrative is specific to the garden. So God's making something unique in the garden and takes that there, taking Cain or Adam and putting him in before he makes Eve in the garden.
Okay, can we just pause for 1 second? Can I ask a couple questions on
Sure.
that thought?
Yeah, I was going to
So-
say the same thing.
So based on that, and I'm not saying I agree or disagree, just
Yeah.
for clarity for people.
Yeah.
So at this point, outside the garden,
Yeah.
there is no sin?
I wouldn't. I don't know if Genesis 1 is speaking.
No, I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
asking with any agenda.
No.
But
Yep.
God's, and here's why I ask.
Yeah.
God's instruction to Adam
Yeah.
is go forth and subdue the earth.
Yeah.
If there are people outside of the garden,
Yeah.
and they're all living in a sinless life,
Right.
what does that command to subdue the earth mean?
Yeah.
And if they're not,
Yeah. then
then does that mean that God called them to go out and to bring people back to Him?
No, that is a great question. I might lean that way, to be honest, personally. If
I
were-
gave two options, so
the way of going out and bring them to him, which would then, I guess, necessitate that there would be sin. Now, that would be defining of what is sin. Could they have been in sin out of ignorance without instruction from God yet? That would be a part of it. The other way to look at it in some of the interpretations that I've seen are different categorizations of Homo sapiens. So that could have been Neanderthals were outside, and so the command was to go then and bring kind of mating between the interspecies could have been part of it. There's lots of different.
So in that case,
Yeah.
God's command to Adam to subdue the earth
Yeah.
included cross-species procreation to bring Neanderthals
into
the
Homo sapiens
state of consciousness.
I don't know, and I wouldn't lean towards that theory myself. I've seen people who have talked about that and read in this kind of conversation where that was part of what was happening. I've seen I may lean towards this,
and that's cool. I'm not asking you
No.
to defend other people. I'm trying to understand where you
Where
are.
I am,
So
I would lean.
in your estimation,
Yeah,
outside the garden,
yeah.
are there sinners or not sinners?
I have a hard time answering that question. I don't know if they can.
If you don't know, that's
Yeah.
fine.
I would say I believe in this time there's other Homo sapiens, our genus of humans, outside of the garden that are then needing to understand living a faithful, fully human life that don't yet have the instructions to do so. So is it sin if they don't have the instruction of how to follow God's way, and they don't have the intimate relation that God and Adam and Eve did? How can He command them? And this is all assuming, and I even debate within my own mind is this actually something that literally happened, the garden and all those pieces? I'd still lean towards yes, but there's a plausibility of this is just how God's instructed and talked about and put into words His starting relationship with humans. Whole nother conversation. So I'll lean for the moment of the conversation towards yes, an actual garden event happened with two Homo sapiens, Adam and Eve.
Okay, so then when God says go forth and subdue,
Yep.
the thought is go out into the world
Yeah.
and help other people learn to have right relationship with God as well.
Yeah, and live fully human.
That's
yeah,
I'm not debating
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah.
I'm simply asking so you can clarify so
Yep.
that we can all understand
Totally.
exactly what you're saying.
Yep. So that would be where I lean.
Okay, cool.
To go out and bring that.
And that helps. You said like that helped you. Like you had friends that were like they couldn't reconcile the science and God thing
Yeah.
or creation thing. That helps you how?
To be able to see both those are valid.
Okay.
Like so, there's even it was actually at a lecture with John Walton, and I can't remember the other gentleman that I went to in college. Like the biological diversity that we have, and that was in Adam in the Genome as well with Scott McKnight and I can't remember the first name, Venema. They wrote a book called Adam in the Genome. We wouldn't have the biological diversity we have now without a base set of 10,000 or more humans. Now, again, God, I totally believe God could work and make
could do it,
super
yes.
unique early genetic material, but I just go, is that how He's worked? If He's made everything ordered, why would He break and disrupt those orders early on? That we wouldn't have the skin tones and all the different variants we have amongst humans now without a wider base set than two humans.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Colin. That's why I wanted to bring that out because I definitely, probably all three of us grew up like seven day creation, and that's it, right? And I've been listening to this crazy podcast for a while now. And I might be starting to lean your way a little bit, Kyle. So I'm gonna sit closer to Doug here.
I haven't spoken yet.
Well, maybe I'll be left out on an island by myself. But yes, so I can appreciate that if that's where the questioning mind goes, or someone who's having trouble. Maybe reconciling science and God.
Yep.
And probably more so, I would say, with the friends I have, people who did not grow up in the church. So
Yep.
they grew up in school hearing all these scientific facts and what the school presents,
Yep.
then would have more issue with that, I think.
Yep.
That there's an option that I guess I would say doesn't wreck anybody's faith. Like, I don't think it matters if you're a 7-day creationist or you believe there's some science behind it or God had people before Adam and Eve, whatever.
Yeah.
That my faith in Jesus isn't going to be destroyed or affected either way by that.
Yep.
Or that's what I'd hope anyways.
Yep.
Because I don't see, like, there's no way of us knowing that. There's no home videos for us to watch. There's no text that we're going to uncover that's going to be like, oh,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah, I think if it helps us follow Jesus better, then that's okay.
And I really appreciate that. I do want to caveat that it's not like, well, let's figure out how we can manipulate the Bible to fit like our modern understanding to jam this in. That gets into a God of the gaps, which eventually human knowledge might get to the point where we squeeze God, all the gaps out and there's no room for God left. We go, it forced me to then actually go back to Genesis and go, what is the concern of Genesis? And what's its writing style? What's it meaning? How has this been handled throughout Jewish history? And so I just am not convinced anymore that Genesis is trying to argue for a 7-day literal creation with just 2 humans that were supposed to start. Like there's so many questions that come out of that when you stop to think of it. The order of creation is different from Genesis 1 to chapter 1 and 2. Were Adam and Eve, like again, you'll have to account for some kind of super gene for Adam and Eve's kids to start mating with their brothers and sisters. And so was God's plan for that kind of like there's so many things that layer on if you just take that as its own argument and go, there's a lot to ask on either side. I believe in a God who could have created things in 7 seconds, let alone 7 days.
Yeah.
But when we go, if God has ordered the world to be able to study it, and we go and we look, what do we find? Francis Collins is another great one. He was the head of the Human Genome Project, wrote a book called The Language of God. Talks about like different things within DNA. Like there's a gene that's switched off in Homo sapiens sapiens that creates vitamin C within our own bodies. Every other mammal has it. That's why they don't get scurvy. But we need to eat vitamin C, and it's turned off because we've had enough of it in our diet that it doesn't function anymore. So did God lay that there as a trick? Like, I'm going to put this in your genetic code, but I'm going to turn it off. Or is it a process of the human evolution? So there's some really interesting
But
stuff.
that could also be, that could also be adaptation, not necessarily evolution. Right? Because there is an effort, there's microevolution and macroevolution.
There's not,
micro.
Right?
Do you-
Microevolution over time adds up to macroevolution. So
That's a theory, but nobody's ever been able to prove evolution. Evolution itself is a theory. So I'm using different words to help the listeners understand.
there are no laws within science. The word theory is applied because it's humbly saying we can't know everything.
But my point
Yeah.
is, nobody has a time machine.
Sure.
This is the accepted theory
Yep.
of science. I'm not convinced
Yeah.
that in 200 years
Yeah.
we will still believe everything we believe now about
No.
most anything scientifically.
Okay.
Because how much do we believe now is what we believed 200 years ago. We are, in the scientific community, they're very much like the church about the book of Revelation. Sure. Right? That we, forever,
Yeah.
Yeah.
the church, when they read Revelation, always assumes they're the last generation.
Sure.
Scientists always assume that they're just on the edge of solving everything.
Sure.
So I'm just not convinced, and I don't have a horse in this race. I don't know the answer, and I'm not as passionate about it as you.
Yeah.
I just look at it and go, okay, however we want to define it.
Yeah.
Micro, macro, adaptation, evolution. These are different terms that different people's use, but at the end of the day, nobody's seen evolution happen,
Sure.
right? It is a, and I'm not debating it. I'm just saying that's reality because we don't live millions of years.
Sure. Yeah.
So all I'm saying is, it is possible
Yeah.
that the gene for vitamin C
Yeah.
could have shifted as adaptation that even over time became permanent and became evolution.
Yep.
Because adaptation has been witnessed,
Yep.
right? When you talk about the, I think it's a type of moth in England that was the same color as the bark of the tree.
Yep.
And then during the industrial age, before there was any sort of filter on the furnaces, the trees all became black.
Yeah.
Right? From just pollution.
Yeah.
And within 4 generations or something, the moth's skin color had changed to black.
Yep.
And then when they put filters and that eliminated that, the trees went back to brown.
Yeah.
And then the moths went back to brown.
Change the colors. Yep.
So there's an example of, you can call it evolution.
Yep.
You can call it adaptation. I don't care.
Sure.
All I'm saying is we've seen that.
Yep. Yep.
And I'm actually arguing for you, even though you're arguing with me, to say,
Yeah.
who knows, right?
Yep.
Humans have always eaten fruits and vegetables.
Yep.
We are all omnivores.
Yep.
And so it's possible that could just be the result
Yep.
of the diet of all of humanity
Yep.
for however long we've been eating fruits and vegetables.
Yep. Totally.
Do you
So,
think
you're being very difficult, and I'm trying to be on your side?
I know that's some language that gets tossed around oftentimes to actually negate evolution.
It's not, but it's. I don't see that it's to negate.
Right.
So, in the reading that I've done,
Yep.
people say that evolution is adaptations that become permanent.
Yep.
So they are two different things, because if you leave an adaptation long enough, according to what I've read from scientists,
Yeah.
it becomes permanent, and then it becomes evolution. So
I'd say adaptation is a part of evolution, which is the meta-narrative or umbrella narrative of changes happening within any given species.
Yes, but if to go back to those moths,
Yeah.
if it changes and then changes back,
Yeah.
there's no evolution that's happened. So you can't use the term evolution because it hasn't evolved into something else because it reverted back to something. So I think we can argue the names if we want to argue it, but evolution at its core, to my understanding, would be permanent changes as a species evolves.
I don't understand it the same way. So let's say that they had applied filters and all of a sudden the trees became pink. The change was readapting to its own environment, and adaptation is a part of the larger evolution. That one just happened to be a change back to something because of the way they filtered, that the adaptation now matched what it had been in the past. So it would have been an evolution either way.
But I think we adapt all the time.
Totally. And I think that's how over millions of years we look at it as this is the large process of evolution.
Yes, I guess I would say we don't always adapt and keep those adaptations.
Fair.
So I'm speaking to them differently.
I think
but we're saying the same thing.
yeah, totally. You were going to say, ask something.
Yeah, just kind of back to the original question. What
Yeah.
do you think about the idea that God created other humans before the fall?
Yeah.
I guess I'm asking both of you. These are things I don't know. Am I late to the party and it's like, oh, well, these theories have been out here for a long time? Or is this new, especially to the Christian world? Because I just think, I remember the first time that I heard a person that I thought was a Christian.
Yeah.
That I thought they were a Christian.
I mean, a Christian. I was at a conference and this guy started talking about evolution like it was totally true. And it was shocking to me because I had never heard Christians talk like that. Every Christian that I had ever bumped up against was a 7-day literist. Right. And I would say, I read this question today and I'm like, oh yeah, no problem. There's probably lots of Christians that believe that. So I'm just wondering.
This is not new. Augustine writes in the 300s. Right. Obviously, it's not literal because the sun and moon don't come till day 4. How could God have judged a day until day 4?
At the same time, though, I would argue that and say it is new because it's new again.
Yes, sure. And so, yeah.
And so 100 years ago, nobody was quoting Augustine.
No, but even C.S. Lewis, when he wrote, he was a big supporter of evolution. You
yes,
can
but
read that.
C.S. Lewis wasn't always really accepted in the church either.
Correct.
So he's talking about in the church, and I'm saying it is fairly new in the last 200 years in the church because I think in the last few hundred years, the church has often resisted anything science has to say.
I would say a part of the church because the Catholic Church, though we have the struggle with their science earlier, for the last 150 years while the fundamentalists have gone, like the big part of the evolution conversation really became a cultural thing with the Scopes monkey trial.
Right. Yes, of course.
Right. So that was where this really blew up to be like a die on the hill thing. The more mainline churches, but especially to my knowledge, the Catholic churches, in correction from Galileo's heliocentric thing that he got killed for, and all the other things that the Catholic Church in that era were bad with and behind on science, have actually reverted to try to be much more supportive of science. And within, can't think of the name, the Catholic home base in Rome,
The Vatican.
Vatican, I believe, has a science wing to it to try to support that. I know they have their own telescope to be doing.
They also have a time machine. I saw a YouTube video on it.
The Catholic Church,
you
as
can
far as
go
I know,
back and you can witness the crucifixion of Christ.
that'd be cool.
And
for a high price.
I really appreciate, in thinking of that question, I didn't mean, it wasn't a setup.
No.
Now that you're talking through it, I'm like, yeah, I appreciate what you said earlier, Kyle, in that they got, like, filling in the gaps, right? That we would be open to this because it's like we don't know, and if it helps us move forward in our faith, then awesome. Compared to just going, well, I want to justify my position. Right? Like I think we've talked about that on the podcast before. That there is a difference, right? So why are we asking these questions? What are we looking for? What are we trying to solve or figure out? Right? I think that's good to always remember. Yeah.
So if I could share my thoughts on question 1. Let me begin with, I've said this before on the podcast, but it's funny to me when fundamentalists want to argue that the Bible is scientifically accurate. When 500 years ago with Galileo, the Bible was proven to not be scientifically accurate. We're taking a document that was written thousands of years ago And instead of letting it stand on its own and let it speak to us from its own world, we're trying to drag it into the current world, and we're trying to say, no, this is what it means. It would be no different than to take your great-great-great-grandfather and drag him into like today without him being able to go through time and then say everything he says, we have to fit our world today into his perspective. And anything that doesn't fit, if he doesn't know what the internet is, then the internet doesn't exist.
Or it's wrong.
Yes, exactly. And so, but we don't allow that. Now, I think that we have to approach the Bible, and I think we should approach the Bible with a thoughtful, wisdom-based, because the Bible over and over and over tells us to pursue wisdom, wisdom-based perspective that says neither Adam or Eve wrote Genesis.
Correct.
Right? Moses and some other authors did the Torah, but Moses is the guy that often gets credit because we don't know who the other people were. Moses, now if we think about Moses, and if we put him in the timeline, Moses doesn't even come on the scene till Exodus. So Moses is taking oral traditions that have been passed down, and possibly, and I will include this because I believe this, possibly things that he has heard spoken from God, because Moses spent a lot of time in that tent of meeting outside the camp when nobody else was there. He was the only one, him and Joshua are the only ones out there. Everybody else is, back in the tent and watching soap operas and stuff. He's the only one who's listening. Wherever he gets this story, he writes it down. His purpose in writing it down was not to define how the earth began, but to talk about how, why, and how we got to where we are. And so I think it's important for us to understand that Moses is not like this omnipresent person who existed from the foundation of the world. That's Christ. Like Moses wasn't there at the foundation of the world looking at everything. It's the Spirit of God that's hovering over the waters at the beginning of Genesis, not Moses. And I don't mean that facetiously, but I want us to think about what's happening. Let's, for simplicity's sake, say Moses wrote all of the Torah. Just for simplicity. Moses is a long ways past the time of Abraham. 400 years from the time of Joseph. Right? Because Israel's in captivity for 400 years. So centuries from the time of Joseph, which would be 100 to 200 years from Abraham. Right? I can't remember how old each person was before they had kids. Between 400 and 500, 400 and 600 years from the time of Abraham. Abraham, you go back in time to Noah. Now there are these stories that are passed down that are how these people, the Israelites, begin to form their identity. And they're not worried about the how did we get, well, I guess they're worried about the how did we get here in the context of sin, understanding human nature. And I think Genesis 1, 2, and 3 does a great job of helping us to understand that. They're less concerned with the scientific method employed. So I lay all that as a foundation because I think we have to look at the Bible and understand what it was originally. And we've talked about this over and over in our Revelation series, right? That we have to understand it in its original context to understand it in this context. And the Israelites are a people who, if Moses wrote it, they're a people who've just come out of 400 years of captivity, 400 years as slaves, and the mentality that 400 years of slaves would have created in them. And now it's time to begin to forge a new identity. And that new identity begins with not just Abraham, but going back to the beginning. And that we aren't just all an accident. And that God was at work in the beginning. And that our God is not like the other gods. And he didn't create humanity just to be servants and just to be people they could toy with. But he created them because he loved them. And he created them in his image. And there is a value in humanity that is inherent in every one of us. And we go, yeah, of course we all know that. Because the Bible has shaped our current world into that. Go back to the time of Moses. This is a radical thought. And then you get to Genesis 3. And sin enters the world. And this explains how these people created in the image of God can do such horrific things. Right? And then you get to Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. And you have the first manifestation and the first illustration of sin. And what is the story of Cain and Abel all about? it's not just history. We are all Cain. We all have sin crouching at the door. That's every one of us.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we have all been Abel, who have done the right thing and been persecuted for it.
Yep.
And so who are we in this story, and what do we need to do about that?
Yep.
Moses is writing this story to cause us to search our own souls. So that is my foundation from which I say, do I think there were other humans? Let me say, first of all, I don't know for sure. I'm going to just say that.
Yep.
I don't know.
Neither do I. I have an opinion where I land, but no, for sure. Yeah.
Shoot, I thought you guys would know.
No, but I think some humility in this area is valid.
Yeah.
But I will say I lean towards yes, because Cain, after he kills Abel, goes and founds a city. If there's no other, and then he has a kid. If there's
And is
nobody,
marked to protect him from others.
Yeah.
well,
right?
yeah, that too. But if there's nobody else, who does he have a kid with?
Yeah.
And if there's nobody else, how do you found a city? You could build a lot of buildings, but there'd be nobody in them.
Correct.
And that wouldn't be a city. That'd be a ghost town. So it seems like there is. And then you look at the theme of cities through the whole Bible.
Yeah.
Cities typically are not viewed well.
Correct.
And cities become Babylon, become Rome, always represent humanity doing the wrong thing, going the wrong way. Like when Cain goes and founds a city, that's a profound statement. And we could spend a lot of time thinking about, man, what am I building in my humanity? Again, where am I Cain?
Yeah.
Where am I building something that's different than what God wants or outside of God's plan?
Yep.
But then you come to Revelation and this beautiful restoration of a new city that is rightly formed, that is both the garden and the city.
Yep.
And so I look at all this and go, yeah, I believe that there were other people, because when you read Genesis 4 with Cain and his interaction with God, he's afraid of other people. He has kids.
Yeah.
And he has kids after he goes away. It's not like there was another, like, it's not like he went back to Adam and Eve and was like, okay, by the way, I killed your secondborn.
Yeah.
And I'm going to need a wife, and then I'm leaving. And they're like, okay, have this other daughter.
Yeah.
There's no record of that.
Yeah.
And it just seems weird to force it into the story.
Yeah.
And so I look at it, I'm like, I don't know how, I don't know what. And this is why I ask you these questions, because I'm curious as to what your perspective is.
Yeah.
Because you are more passionate on it. And to be honest, it matters more to you than it does to me.
Sure.
And I come to the point where I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But I think that it's pretty clear in Genesis 4, there's other people there.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, because it does point out that we have to come to the table, and we almost have to jam something into the story for most people to make sense of it. Like you said, I've heard people interpret, well, the Hebrew, they wouldn't have traced the females, so when Adam and Eve's kids are listed, it doesn't say that there were females, but there could have been. It just wasn't tradition for them to write them, so
And
Cain took one
that's
of the
legitimate.
wives.
Look at the lineage of Cain that goes from
Exactly.
there. They don't mention...
Any woman.
Three or four generations later, it mentions he has 2 wives.
Yeah.
But there's no mention of wives' names.
Correct.
Ever.
And so, again, but you're reading something into the text to make sense of it. So I go, either way, you're doing that to be able to follow the narrative
And we have to
forward.
be honest enough to acknowledge,
Correct.
however we're reading something into the text, that we are reading something into the text.
Exactly. So I just don't think that Genesis necessitating one style of reading.
Yes. And so for me, I go, here's where I land. But the one thing that I wish would be that everyone would approach these texts with more humility.
Yep.
That everyone would approach them and go, we don't know.
Yep.
Because I hear, and I'm not saying this is you,
Right.
and I've never heard this as you,
Yeah.
but I've heard many people on both sides
Yep.
Yeah.
who state their opinion like it had to be 7-day creation. I guess 6-day creation, because the 7th day he
rest.
didn't really do anything. Or it has to be evolution. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I
I agree with you there. Yeah.
right? And so I think some humility is needed, and some remembering, why was this book written?
Yep.
At the begin, like, go back to the beginning. Go back to, let's assume it was Moses again.
Yeah.
Why did he write this book?
Yeah.
It wasn't because the people were wandering around the wilderness going,
Who's
How-
my great
how did-
grandfather?
or how did we get here,
Yeah.
right? From a scientific point of view,
Yeah.
how did we get here?
Yeah.
Because that, all of those questions, which are valid questions, I don't have a problem with them, they're all the result of Enlightenment thinking, which came 500 years ago.
Yep. Totally.
I am really glad that you guys over the years here have just come back to, or starting to come around to my point of view, where we sit on the fence and we just say we don't know. I appreciate.
I feel
that
like
you guys
I feel like neither of us sat on the fence. We both said there were other people there.
And actually, I agree with you. So I can't even. I set this whole thing up with my corny joke because I wanted to go after you for all your heresy.
Well, we haven't done question 2 yet.
And
So
and I am like, yeah, I probably agree the same thing.
there's
All right,
plenty of space for the second
Question
part.
2, I feel, is a little more fun. It's about all these animals and creatures that we don't like that cause us pain and irritation in our lives. Were they there before the fall?
Well, I think the underlying question to this, which isn't as much fun, and this is where I think I'm going to probably get in more trouble with you, Blake.
Okay.
Is that necessitates death is what
Yes,
the carrion animals
absolutely.
are, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
those animals,
Vultures, coyotes, maggots, all feed off dead carcasses.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Right. Okay. Good.
So
Yeah.
that's the purpose of that question, which then precludes. Well, one is were there other humans and was death happening?
Yes.
And 2, so then how did these carrion animals happen after? Are they a result of sin? Because if there was no death, these things would have starved to death.
Okay.
Predators would.
Which is an oxymoron. If there was no death, they would have starved to death.
Right.
All right.
So I do believe they existed, which then I would say then says there was death before the fall, and I think there's a pretty good case for that. I do.
All right. Now you are getting in trouble with me because I want to hear
Yeah,
this.
and this is where I knew we were going. So this is why I'm going to get in trouble. I was looking at their time going, like, we got 20 minutes left, and we took 30 on that first one. So Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve sinned, God talks amongst his council or amongst himself, depending on what interpretation you have. You can jump there.
Yep.
We need to get these people out of the garden, lest they live forever by having access to the tree.
Okay.
That leads to a whole lot of theological conclusions for me, including my view of hell and all those things, that humans were never meant to be eternal. So without access to that tree, Adam and Eve would have died, which means death was a part of their living. They were only being sustained by their relationship to God, which allowed them access to that tree. So death was already a part of their wiring from the beginning, and that's why God responds to it.
I feel like that's pretty flimsy, though, because you could say that they would have lived forever.
No, I don't think so. Because
If they had never left the garden, they could have kept eating of that tree.
exactly, which is why God says we need to get them out of here and guard the garden and cut off access to the tree.
I'm not debating that part,
Yeah.
but I'm debating that you're saying they would have died if they hadn't sinned because everything died, but they would have.
No, the only thing keeping them going, was access to that tree.
Right, but had they not sinned, they would have always had access to the tree.
Correct.
So
But-
then it's possible then, like your argument defeats itself, because then they could have lived forever.
And they could have, and I'm totally agreeing with
But you're
that.
using that to argue to say there already was death.
No, I'm saying so. I'm just laying that to say death wasn't created after that. Death was already written a part of the fabric because they knew what that was going to be. You have to be able to eat of this tree in order not to die. Just to lay the argument. The other
I think
part of
that
it,
I don't think that's a pretty strong argument. I think that's a pretty weak argument, but I'll accept it.
leading out to that though, and maybe this will be more convincing, that the very fact of things growing and soil being there and all these sort of animals that have to die to make space for them to take something that has a really short life cycle. They would have piled up and piled up and piled up and piled up and piled up, and Adam would have been overrun by these things with certain short lifespans. Certain predators keep populations. As a hunter, you would know that certain predators are really important for keeping populations in check. That the function of the ecosystem requires death, and I don't think anywhere in Genesis 1, 2, 3, or 4 does it indicate that animal death is what was being spoken to at all. It's only referring to human death. Even when Paul jumps back, through one man came death, one man also life, he does not again refer that death to anything else was prohibited. It was only human death that was brought in through Adam. Doesn't necessitate that there wasn't death for all these other carrion animals to function.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think you kind of spoke to that earlier. I guess you'd be assuming in that theory then, or that idea, that God created order and the order has never changed. That it's always like however he started this world, that the order has stayed the same.
Right.
Where my initial thought to that is back to, and you even said that God can do anything. So
God created super soil without dead plants as a part of the mixture of soil.
Yeah, so did the order change when Adam and Eve sinned? I guess that would be the presumption to ascribe to the fact that there was no death before.
Yep.
If you're saying there's lots of people around, then yes, I can understand overpopulation and stuff. So something
God was
changed.
supernaturally keeping them in check for sure. You could say, yep, God was allowing vultures to eat vegetables at the time, and their lion stomachs worked off grass, and their teeth were shaped differently so they could eat grass better. And then God
I've
changed
heard
all
those
that up.
stories.
Like, sure, God could have done all that. I just don't think that's how it worked.
Okay, but here's where, and I'm not debating your point.
Sure,
I'm debating that you have a strong case.
sure.
I think what you need to say, and again, I think we need to approach this with a little bit of humility,
Yep.
is to say, this is what I think,
Yeah.
more than I have a strong case. Because
Sure.
that's the only thing of anything you said that I take exception with.
Sure.
Because I could use the Bible to argue the exact opposite.
Yep.
And just go to Romans 8, where all creation is under the effects of sin.
Totally.
And use that to say there was no death. All creation, all creatures were sustained by this tree.
Yep.
So you could argue that, and you could argue
Sure.
that all death, including the creation
Yeah.
of predator-prey relationship,
Yep.
is the result of sin.
Yep.
Because is it in Isaiah where it talks about someday the
wolf
lion will
and
lay
the-
down with the
The
lamb?
wolf and the lamb, and then the lion and the lamb. Yep.
And that is a picture of restoration of what was lost. So you could just as well, and I'm not
Yeah.
debating your point.
Yep.
All I'm debating is
Yep.
I got a strong case.
Sure.
Is that you could use just different verses
Yep.
to come up with a completely separate and different argument. And either way, you have to choose the verses that support your position
Yes.
and ignore the ones who don't.
Sure.
So all I would say is
Yeah.
you could say, this is what I think.
Yep.
I don't think you can say, I have a pretty strong case.
I think there's a pretty strong case. I agree with what you're saying, but that death was something that was always on the table.
As a possibility, possibly.
Yeah, and I think the only way to hold a view where these things were never there is to write death off as a possibility at all.
Yes, but
back to the Platonic view of human souls are eternal, and I just that was never the case. That was not what was created.
And that's what you think, and I'm totally fine with that. All I'm saying is death as a possibility
Yeah.
exists in the garden when every animal is eating the tree.
Sure.
It's just not going to be experienced.
Sure.
It is always a possibility.
Sure.
And that Adam, and I'm not saying this
Yep.
is my position.
Yep.
I'm not saying this at all.
Yep.
Like I say, the only thing I'm arguing
Yep.
is where you say I've got a pretty strong case.
Totally fair.
Because I think you can say I've got a case.
That I've got a case. I just go.
And I'm totally fine with your case.
Yeah.
And I might lean towards your case.
right.
But I would lean towards it with just a lot more humility than you and say, at the end of the day, I don't know. Because it is just as feasible to say there was an old order and that the lion did lay down with the lamb and that there was this utopian society and there would be Christians who I would totally accept. If they say, that's what I believe, I'm totally cool. You love Jesus, I love Jesus. I don't
No debates there, yeah.
care.
Yeah.
I really don't.
Yeah.
And so for me, I'm like, it's possible that vultures, coyotes, and maggots
Yeah.
lived on a different diet before the fall.
Right.
It's possible God created them after because the whole ecosystem shifted. Any of these things is possible
Yep.
depending on which view we want to hold.
Yep.
And so all I would say is, I don't think you can say you have a pretty strong case.
Sure.
I think it's interesting that just in the two questions,
Yep.
it's probably easier for me anyway, more humans before the fall. Yes, that explains more to me or helps me fill in maybe those gaps, right?
Right.
But then question two, if we're asking where did death come from, then it's easier to go, well, then it's 7-day creation. They've only been around for 50 years, maybe at tops, and then death comes in.
Right.
Because that's an easier answer, and that fills in the gaps easier, right? So it's funny how,
Or
trying to find the thing that appeases what
Yeah.
helps our mind go, how did this work?
Or there is a third option that we don't know.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
Then
Yeah.
there's always that.
Yeah.
The Genesis narrative is not written as a scientific documentary,
Yeah.
right? It's not a National Geographic special.
Totally.
It is the story of humanity created in the image of God,
Yep.
and then sullying that image by sin.
Yep.
And so wherever you land, however physical,
Yep.
however literal you land in that story,
Yep.
all I would ask is we need to all approach it with humility
Yeah.
because somebody can take a different set of
Totally.
scripture and argue the other side. And all we'll do is argue. And it's like so many of the theological places of argument
Yeah.
that people take the scriptures they want. Shout out to Scott McKnight, the Blue Parakeet. You know, we grab the scriptures we like, and the
Yeah.
ones that prove our point, we ignore the ones that don't, instead of allowing the Spirit to challenge us with the ones that don't.
Yep.
And this is the same.
Yep.
This is the same thing. We
totally.
just have to approach it with humility, and we have to love Jesus. So ultimately, my answer to question 2.
Yep.
I don't know. I like to
Yeah.
think of personally, and I've
Yeah.
made you crazy with this. Is I like to just think of crazy scenarios that could be supported because you can't argue them. And why not? If you're going to dream something wild.
Get big, get huge.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Why not? If you're going to dream big. And so you're like, no, we have to stay grounded within this. And I'm like, but we don't. We're in this place where we're talking about endless possibilities. And so let's dream. Why not come up with crazy scenarios that could have been?
Like such as?
Like Adam and Eve were taken to another planet. And I don't believe that. I just say that to drive you insane.
And you do successfully every time.
I know, it's awesome. Because, for me, that flows out of, sorry, didn't mean to whack the mic. That flows out of the freedom that has come
Yep.
to me as a result of saying, I don't have to have an opinion on this.
Yeah.
So I can have any crazy thought I want because for me, and I see the difference between you and I
Yeah.
is that for you, this became something that was essential to the preservation of your faith.
Yep.
And so I respect that. I absolutely do.
Yep.
Never was for me. And just maybe it's generations, maybe it's personality, maybe whatever.
Yep.
I grew up with 6-day creation.
Yep.
And I don't think, like I can remember going to high school
Yep.
and hearing about evolution.
Yeah.
And some people getting like up in arms about it, and me going, okay. Like it just never mattered to me,
Right.
in the same way that I think it matters. And I think that's a result of every person being different.
Yeah.
For me, the bigger thing that was a stumbling block to my faith,
Yeah.
and wrestling through,
Yeah.
was how do you reconcile
Yeah.
the fact that people who have never heard about Jesus, because the church never went to them,
Yeah.
going to hell.
Yeah.
That was the one. And so for you, that was where you were like, oh my word, how do I hold on to this faith that I value and reconcile it with this thing?
Yeah.
That was never a thing for me.
Yeah.
But for me, I struggled a long time with, can I stay being a Christian if a perfectly just God has somebody stand before them and goes, you have to go to hell because you never believed in Jesus. And the person goes, nobody ever told me about Jesus. And God goes, well, I told my church to, but they really sucked at their job. But my hands are tied, so off to hell you go.
Yep.
That was my struggle.
Yep.
And so I think different struggles
Yep.
cause us to be more passionate about different things.
Yep. You were leaning in. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, it makes me think of Brian Zahn's When Everything's on Fire, like thinking through the deconstruction idea is what is our faith actually built on, right? When those things that could be a pillar, like for some people, the 6-day creation, if all of a sudden that gets not necessarily debunked, but there's another theory out there, then do they just lose their faith in God completely? Or are they able to go, no, this, like we're saying, we really don't know the whole Genesis story as far as understanding exactly how it all went. So that's okay. I can still have faith in the God of creation who made this all happen and who ordered it and stuff. Nothing's changed there, right? And that would be my caution to anybody listening to our podcast or seeking out the Bible or going to church is just what do you actually believe? Like, what do you believe in? And what are the things that we can hold open-handed and say, I'd love to figure that out. I mean, God has asked us to explore this world and to all the rest. But I'm not crushed if all of a sudden that's not what I thought it was, right?
And I think we need to help. And I hope this podcast is helpful for people to understand that we're all going to go through seasons of deconstruction, various stages of our life. But what we do with that can either become a stumbling block to us,
Yes.
or can become a stepping stone.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. I always joke around that I actually believe in the Hebrews 11 creation narrative.
Okay.
Right? Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. That's where I go, okay, however the details worked out, I'm fine. That to me, because that again speaks to what I think is the heart of the Genesis
I completely
1 to
agree with
3 narrative,
Yep.
which is it wasn't just a divine accident. It wasn't just an accident. There is a divine purpose, and there is something greater than just what we see in it.
And I think Genesis 1 and 2 would agree with you. I think that's the purpose, and that's
But
where
not how some people interpret it.
No, exactly. I think that's what the author of Hebrews, that's where they're even able to get to that point of writing such a thing, because they know what Genesis 1 and 2 is concerned about, because they're so steeped in this history of it. And yeah, like I appreciate the reminder there of like, this, as I mentioned, was opened the door for so many other things. It gave me the tools that when I got to those questions in hell and how the Gospels have different timelines for different things, like Genesis conversation gave me the tools to walk with the Bible in a new way. And again, I will say, I have lots of friends who are 7-day creation still that I consider great brothers and sisters in Christ and agree with. And I also really love to debate this one. So I get fired up. I'm like, come on. And I think the nature, sometimes we forget the cameras are here. We're just having fun.
I love to debate it with you because I love to just make you crazy.
I know you do.
And that's only because if you know your Bible well enough, you can oftentimes use a scripture to debate a scripture.
Oh, yeah.
And that's why, at the end of the day, we're supposed to follow Jesus more than we follow the Bible.
Totally. And I'm convinced that if one day I'm proven wrong, first thing in heaven, God's like, "Nah, it was 7 days, man." I'm like, okay, cool. I had a lot of fun debating it. And I think there's a lot of camaraderie joined in just my closest friends are the ones who I can have these debates with. And you and I've had lots of debates about a lot of things, and that's always been appreciative of our pursuit of faith. Has been sharpened by that. At least I feel that way.
I always say when I stand before Jesus, like the Revelation series, if when I'm standing before Jesus, he's like, "You totally got that wrong."
Yeah.
That's going to be the least of the things I'm going to have to deal with that day.
Totally. Right? I'm not worried about that, but it's fun in the midst. And I personally really enjoy debate, so it's fun.
As do I.
Yeah.
So,
Well, with all that, we will
actually,
wait for...
No, hang on a second.
Okay.
I think with all of that, I think a brief shout out for when everything's on fire.
Yeah.
If you are wrestling
totally.
with some different areas of faith, feel free to submit a question. If you got questions about this, we'd love to talk about it some more next week on our AER. But if this area of maybe what we just touched on, deconstruction, and whether it's creation evolution, whether it's the idea of a just God sending people who never heard about Jesus to hell, maybe it's something else that we haven't even addressed here.
Yep.
Brian Zahn's book, When Everything is on Fire, is a fantastic tool to help you deconstruct well.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, with that being said, then we will see you guys next week. We got some questions in here, but if you got more, please send them our way. We would love to answer them and even get some debate going as we do.
We never do that.
Talk to y'all later.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com. Thanks for tuning in.